Hello, and welcome to It Matters How We Treat One Another, the social psychology show. I'm your host, Matthew David Vasco. If you subscribe to this show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, then thank you. This is a new show, and we're grateful for each and every one of our subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please consider doing so. We've got lots more exciting episodes and guests coming up, and you don't want to miss a single one. This is a special episode that we're releasing on International Trans Day of Visibility. So, officially, this is our first of two episodes for the month of April, but we're releasing it a little early in honor of our trans friends of the show. Today's guest is a longtime trans advocate and an all-around nice guy, Taylor Chazan. We open today with our Inspiring News segment. If inspiring things are happening in your neck of the woods, then please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. That's M as in Matthew, D as in David, VASKO @gmail.com. And let me know. This week's inspiring news comes from Human Rights Watch. The headline reads, quote, LGBTQ plus victories did happen in 2023, seeing the bright side of the fight for queer equality. The article highlights several advancements in LGBTQ plus rights globally, including decriminalization of same-sex relationships in 5 more countries, a UN declaration that laws against same-sex relationships between women are a human rights violation, and comprehensive LGBTQ plus legislation in Spain in 2023 that included, quote, a provision allowing for legal gender recognition through a simple administrative procedure based on self-identification, basically allowing people to legally identify as the gender they know themselves to be. I think so often the news focuses on bad news or harm happening in the world, possibly because of humans' strong negativity bias, as we learned in our last episode. And it's inspiring to know that advancements in human rights, because LGBTQ plus rights are, after all, human rights, are happening all over the world as well. Again, if you know of inspiring news happening in your area, please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. Thanks. Before we transition to our interview, I want to say a few things to help set the stage. At its heart, this is a science show. We focus upon the social science of social psychology. That is the foundation of It Matters How We Treat One Another. That said, gender-affirming care for trans people is science. I often tell people that when I started studying psychology in college in the mid-1990s, gender-affirming care was the norm then, 30 years ago. And we learned at that time in the 1990s that gender-affirming care had become the norm in the 1970s. So we can conclude that gender-affirming care has been the norm in the scientific community for over 50 years, and it is still the norm. Society might be slow in catching up, but the science is sound. Every major medical and psychiatric organization supports gender-affirming care. And now, on to our interview. I am here with Taylor Chazan. Taylor is a dad of 2, a lifelong trans advocate, and is currently in school for social work. Taylor, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being on. I really appreciate it. So, our topic this episode is Trans Day of Visibility.
Mhm.
I plan to actually drop the show on International Trans Day of Visibility, March 31st.
Great.
And so I just thought it would be great to talk a little bit about, how to be a good trans ally, and trans advocate for the fans of the show who, want to be kind and loving and caring toward people and, try to do right by people. So first, just to get to know you a little bit, for our audience to get to know you, is there anything that you want to share about your own life or lived experience?
So coming out has been pretty much a lifelong journey for me. I consider gender to be very much a spectrum. When I first came out, I was in my teenage years. I was 14, 15. And I came out as gay, um, but I knew that there was something beyond that. And my mom tells me that when I was 2 years old, I told her that I was a boy and that I just hadn't grown a penis yet. And she just did not really know what to make of that. This was in Plano, Texas in the 80s. So she was not sure what that meant. And then as I started to get older, I started to see some representation of trans folks in the media, but it was mostly like Jerry Springer, mostly trans women, and very much like a spectacle sort of thing. But I was constantly drawn to that. Something was like it resonates to a degree, but I don't see any trans men, so that doesn't really make sense. And then as I got older, I learned about trans men, and I started to transition when I was 21. And so it's been over half my life at this point. And, I think that it's fun. I think gender is a fun thing to explore. And I think it's important to acknowledge the spectrum for everyone.
Sure, sure. I haven't mentioned this before on the show, but I am actually a certified sex ed teacher. And something we teach in the Our Whole Lives curriculum is that gender is a spectrum, sexual orientation is a spectrum, and people can fall in all sorts of different places on the spectrum. And with regard to gender, people might not even be on the spectrum, right? That there are
Hmm.
people for whom they just like, well, I'm non-binary. I don't fit anywhere on the spectrum,
Hmm.
one way or the other, or anywhere in between.
Hmm.
So that's
Absolutely.
pretty, I would say pretty standard view nowadays, in the medical world, in the psychological world, and in the opening of this episode, I established how, really, with regard to gender affirming care, this is settled science, right? And has
Hmm.
been for a long time. I know there are a lot
Absolutely.
of, things going on in the country, but none of it is science based.
Correct.
The science is settled on this matter. It is not up for debate, and psychological and psychiatric organizations take a very firm view that gender affirming care is the way to go.
Yes.
It is the best science. So, what are some of the most basic things that the average person can do to be kind and caring toward trans and non-binary people? Just they might have, say, a trans or non-binary person in their office or school. What's the most basic thing they can do just to be kind, caring? Just treat them like, a fellow human being, if you will, like,
Yeah.
what can they do?
That treat us like we're fellow human beings. I think one of the really really basic things is making sure you're getting correct names and pronouns. That is so important to trans people, and it's really rooted in basic decency and respect. Um, it's especially true for anyone that uses pronouns that are beyond the binary, like she, her, or he, him pronouns. Um, there's a lot of discourse of how they, them pronouns are complicated or it's not correct grammar, which isn't true. They're not complicated. We've all used they, them pronouns in a singular manner growing up. It's totally grammatically correct. And when you complain about being inconvenienced by someone else's pronouns, what you're saying is that they're inconveniencing you by being themselves, and that you don't have time to respect them. And that's really important that trans people are seen and are believed in our identities. You know yourself better than I know you, and I know myself better than you know me. And so when I come to you and I say, hey, I use he, him pronouns, that doesn't need to be a question. Even if 3 weeks ago I was using they, them pronouns, maybe things have settled more for me. Or maybe I've been using he, him pronouns for 20 plus years and I'm discovering that I feel more like a they, them. Um, when I tell you, hey, I'm using they, them pronouns now, that just needs to be a quick change. Trans people are doing a huge majority of the work in the transition process.
There you go.
All we ask is correct names, correct pronouns, and to treat us like we are a fellow human.
Just
We're not
be
monsters.
respectful, right? Be
We are
respectful.
kind of unicorns, but
Beautiful unicorns.
exactly, exactly.
So let's say a person, in a workplace or school would want to be a true ally to trans and non-binary people. How could they be an ally?
By listening, um, and being observant of the workplace or the school environment. So, if you hear your new trans friend saying, the bathroom situation is really uncomfortable for me. Like, there's only one men's bathroom and it's a urinal, and I'm I never get to use the stall or whatever. Maybe advocate for all gender bathrooms. That's something that is super inclusive. It includes non-binary folks. It includes agender folks. Um, because having to decide between a men's room or a women's room can be really frightening for trans folks, who are early in their transition, who aren't transitioning, um, and there's a lot of judgment around that. So advocating for more inclusive spaces,
Hmm.
um, doing stuff like not holding icebreakers that require childhood photos is a big thing,
Oh,
um, because as a grown adult, I look totally different than my childhood photos. And if I go into a workplace that I'm not comfortable being out in, um, that would automatically out me. Um, the childhood photos that I have, most of them I'm in dresses or I have long feminine hair. So that's something that can also be addressed, is just being aware. Um, and also, you know, we have this amazing tool of Google. Um, so not asking invasive questions is really key. If you have a question that's a general trans issue, Google it. See if you can figure it out. And then if you can't and you need some further clarification or you want to hear a personal side to it, you can ask your friend, like, hey, I was doing some research on this and I really wanted to ask your opinion. Is that okay? Um, and also, I think another thing is trans folks are often pigeonholed into just being the trans person.
mm,
Um, and we are much more complex than that. For me, like, my gender is one of the most boring things about me. That's I am who I am. Like, I love being trans. I
Yeah.
feel honored that I am trans. It's a great thing. It's also challenging. Um, and it's something that like I don't know how to not think about, but there are times when I'm in a situation where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm trans.
Mm.
I gotta adjust how I'm acting right now. Yeah. So being an ally would be being aware of the situation. I had this wonderful coworker while I was working in production, and we were on a big road trip across the United States, and he did this thing because I shared a story with him where when we go to a bar, never really know the bathroom situation. It can be really nerve wracking, especially in bars because it's the men's room can be no locking doors or you know it can be rough for a trans person, and not necessarily the safest spot. And he started to do this thing where anytime we went into a bar specifically, he would immediately go to the bathroom, check it out, and come back and just quietly be like, hey, there's three stalls, two of them don't lock, but the one on the furthest right locks, and it's pretty clean. So stuff like that you might not think about, but that went a long way for me in our friendship because I just felt seen from that one comment that I made to him, and he then just proactively would let me know, thinking about you, want to make sure you're safe. Here you are.
That's I mean, it's kind of beautiful in a
Yeah,
way, right? I mean, it's a way to be kind and caring and thoughtful.
yeah.
Um, I like the advice to get to know the whole person, right? Trans people are complicated, whole, worthy, wonderful people, just like everybody else, right? And they have other hobbies and interests
Mm-hmm.
outside of their gender, and get to know those things about a person too. I think, there's
Absolutely.
an allyship in that, maybe
Yeah.
being an ally is kind of like being a good friend.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's one of those things that it's a difficult thing to navigate sometimes as a trans person because I'm very open and out for a majority of my life, in many ways. And I think it's really important to be visible as a trans person. And I have that luxury and that privilege that I can be visible. And it's something that I prioritize for myself. But there are situations where I want people to get to know me as Taylor and not as Taylor the trans person. Um, so sometimes I do hold back and outing myself, and then there have been times where I've done that, and then people are like, "Well, why didn't you tell me beforehand?" It's like, "Well, I didn't need to tell you beforehand. Like, we're grabbing a cup of coffee. There's nothing about me being trans that's relevant to this situation."
yeah, right. It just didn't come up. It just didn't come up.
Yeah.
And then we hear it seems like a more modern term within the last maybe 5 years or so, advocacy, being an advocate,
Mm-hmm.
going from ally to advocate.
Mm-hmm.
So how could a person move from with regard to their trans and non-binary friends, how could they move from being an ally to an advocate?
Yeah, I think advocate and accomplice are two really really big moves that the trans community needs to have more of, especially right now. Within the past few years, there's been a huge influx of anti-trans legislation, which creates more trans hate. Um, so we need advocates that will stand up and say, "Hey, this isn't okay." We don't need bills that regulate bathrooms. We don't need bills that regulate sports. We don't need bills that force teachers to out their students to parents when it's a not safe situation.
Mhm.
Um, we do trust medical professionals to treat people the way that they need to be treated. So we don't need laws coming in and regulating our medical care. Gender affirming care, like you said, is promoted by every medical profession. It is science based. It is what is known as the best option for folks medically and psychologically, spiritually. Um, and to deny that care can cause great damage. Um, so being aware of the discourse that's going on, stopping conversations when you hear people talking about um, disinformation, like the negative impacts of puberty blockers, and that what they're doing is really, there's this whole conversation that puberty blockers are dangerous and they will cause infertility down the road. And these aren't true things. So, really educating yourself about what is true,
Mhm.
um, especially when it comes to gender affirming care and trans youth. Look to the professionals, don't look to the opinion pieces. Um, and and speak up. Um, be out there and say, hey, this is wrong. Like, we need to protect our trans youth.
Yeah.
We need to protect our trans friends. Um, that's one thing that we really need people to do. And for being an accomplice, like, we need people that are standing with us and not just standing for us. Like, we need folks out there in the marches, showing up at the school board meetings, showing up in the city council meetings, saying, hey, there's a wave of hate that's happening. It's not okay. What are you going to do about it? You know, stuff like that is really where we need advocates and allies to be there for us.
Yeah, I think I need to correct myself because I said advocate, but I really meant accomplice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There is a difference there. The way I understand it is the accomplice would let the trans person take the lead and still step up, right, and take
Mm-hmm.
action. Um, um, am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So an ally would be someone that, and allies are amazing. They're important, necessary, love them. I'm not saying anything negative about allies. And I think you can be an ally and an accomplice at the same time. And that's ideal. But an ally is someone that, is aware of stuff and is like, yeah, I respect trans people. Um, but an accomplice is someone that is saying, I love and support trans people in every aspect, and I am showing up to make sure that they are able to live their lives as fully as they can. I'm making sure that they are safe in our communities. I'm making sure that they're safe in our schools. And this is what I'm going to do about it. So there's someone that is going to look at the company policy and make sure that the medical insurance that the company uses includes gender affirming care. They're and doing that proactively without it being the burden of a trans person to see, oh, I'm gonna have to fight to get this medical care covered, or I'm gonna have to fight to make sure I'm included in this workplace. So an accomplice is someone that will take that on with us
Uh,
and say, "Hey, I got you. Let's do it."
yeah, it's the scary thing I see happening on the news is whenever a person in power takes a stance that vilifies or demonizes or dehumanizes a trans person, because that is so harmful, that is so damaging. And if I could do one thing, right, with this show, it would be for everyone to be respectful towards trans people, kind, caring, be in their corner, on their side, you know.
Mhm.
What kind of advice do you have for a parent whose child, youth, teen has come out to them as trans or non-binary?
Love them and believe them.
Mm,
Um, and let them know that. Let them know that you see them, that you care about them, and that you are with them. That you are going to be there to support whatever they need. Um, and it's one of those things. I talked about like name and pronoun at the very beginning, and that's something that I personally give a little bit of leeway to parents on that, um, because this is a person that they've raised for X amount of years. So it can be an adjustment just because of we have the habit of using someone's name and pronouns, but being very aware um, of the impact that that can have. And, if you make the mistake, correct it immediately, move on. Catch yourself. Don't have your kid have to be the one to be like, Dad,
mm,
I don't use that name anymore. Dad, I use they pronouns. That's something that uh, is really meaningful. Also, checking in with them about where they feel safe, where they feel unsafe,
mm,
um, ways that can make them feel safe, ways that they need you to show up to support, and also checking in with them about ways that they don't need you to show up to support. They might not need you to show up at the school waving a trans flag every day at pickup, but they might need that at some, protest. They might really want you to show up like that. But checking in with them,
mm,
really making sure that they know. And if they're needing to talk to a professional, get them those resources. If they are seeking community, help them find community. That's a really important thing that you can also do things like make sure that your friendship group reflects them. So you know hopefully you would have another trans or non-binary friend that they can see is older and thriving, that you know can have a relationship with them as not necessarily a mentor, but just seeing that trans people can thrive is a huge, huge, huge thing for trans youth. Um, and now it's becoming more common, which is great. But there is definitely a fear that I experienced when I was coming out as trans of we're not accepted. Like my life expectancy, I don't know. Like when I came out to my mom was around the same time that the Brandon Tina movie was coming out, the Boys Don't Cry, and
mm,
so her only concept of a trans man was this story of a man being murdered. Um, and so that was really, she took it to heart and was terrified for me. But then when I was like, Mom, we can live, like it's okay, we can live.
right.
And it's people talking about the trans folks that they love. um, but I do want to put a caveat on that, and that it is important to let the trans and non-binary people in your life out themselves. So, you know, you can say things like, "Oh, I was talking to a trans friend of mine, and they said this," but saying things like, "Oh, I was talking to my trans friend Taylor, and he said this," can be challenging because if I meet that person down the road and I didn't know that I'm out to them, like that takes my own agency away.
Right.
Um, so, for parents, the same thing. Like advocate for your child, absolutely, um, but also like know that it's their story to tell. Um, seek advice from friends. Don't lay it on your child all the time, but let them know that they have their own agency to tell their story.
Yeah. I think maybe that's like rule number one of allyship is never out your friends, right? Um, just to let people tell their own stories. What I think you may have already covered this, but one question I had was, what should a person do? I see this happen in situations, which is why I bring it up. What should a person do if they accidentally misgender someone, maybe use the wrong pronoun? Uh,
Mhm.
what's sort of the best practice around that for the person who made the mistake?
Best practice is to correct yourself, apologize, move on. Don't make it about yourself.
Mm,
So, like, you know, for example, I have a my first non-binary professor this year, which is super exciting. I love seeing representation everywhere, and it is really common in my classroom for them to get misgendered. Um, and you know, there's other students that'll be like, "Oh, I meant, oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm so, I get it, I get it. I'm so sorry." But that takes away from what they're talking about in the class. So just doing "Oh, I'm sorry, they move on." That's it.
okay.
Um,
Don't make
yeah,
too big a deal out of it.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Also, know that mistakes happen. Like, I misgender folks on accident. Like, it happens. Like, you know, it's common, but it's the pattern. Like, if you're consistently misgendering someone, we notice. We notice that you're not making that effort. But if it's a one-time thing, like, and as you're like speeding by and talking a whirlwind, like, it happens. We get that. Um, but it's the intent behind it, because that's where the impact is going to be the hardest.
I see what you're saying. Um, maybe uh, the important thing is that the person knows you're making the effort. You that you, you're not trying. I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Yeah.
Um, um, how about the term dead naming? What does that mean?
So dead naming is a term that has been used in the past. I take some issue with it, because I think it's just the concept of dead naming is using someone's previous name. Um, that's the basic terminology of it. I have an issue with that because it acts as if we are dead before we come out. And once we are
Hmm.
out, that's when we start to live. And there is an element of that where like we are more able to live our authentic life once we come out. But I had a full life before I came out. Um, my
Hmm.
childhood is not erased. I was not dead then. My mom did not lose a child. Um, I changed. That's it. So I do like to use more like um birth name or given name, um, would be how I usually phrase it. People still use the term dead name, but I think it's one of those things where just changing the wording a little bit is more inclusive of our whole lives, um, and doesn't deny our existence before we came out.
I understand. I hadn't really thought of it that way. So it is it's complicated.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely important that once someone has chosen their name and has let you know this is my chosen name, this is the name that I go by, this is who I am, that is used. And it's the same as like misgendering someone or using the wrong pronouns. We notice the intent behind it. If like there are people in my life that still use my birth name and they are unsafe people for me.
Mm,
Um, They're the only people that use that. And there's two.
Oh.
So they are
Hmm.
unsafe people to me. I know that. Everyone
Hmm.
else, there's my family can get confused if they're telling a story about me in my childhood. My mom and I had that back and forth for a while. She's like, "But what if I am telling a story about when you were 7? I didn't know you as Taylor then." And I'll be like, "Well, I'm Taylor now. So you use Taylor. That's who I was then too."
Yeah.
And she's been able to adjust that. But that's when I have noticed the unintentional slip ups of like, "Oh, well, I knew Taylor back when he was blah blah blah." Um, I was still Taylor then. You can still
Got it.
call me Taylor. Yeah.
That's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Just use the name you're using today.
Yeah.
Um, um, we hear the term microaggression
Mhm.
sometimes. Um, maybe what's an example of a microaggression that a trans person might face, and how can we avoid that or those microaggressions?
Um, One that I hear a lot about is, well, you don't look trans,
Mm,
or I wouldn't have known. Um, with the implication that looking trans is a specific thing, that um, that trans people are others, that we are not normal, and at the same time, we're not. We're great. We have uniqueness about us. But I think that that's something that I hear a lot of, like, well, I would never have known that you're trans, as
mm,
if being trans is a negative thing.
mm.
Um, that's one thing that really gets me.
I see.
Yeah. And I think just being aware of trans people have a huge complexity behind us. Like the community is vast, and we don't have a single trans experience. It just
Mm,
doesn't happen. We are in every culture, in every society, all across the world, and have been since the beginning of history. So, like, I can't speak for every trans person. Um, so if you know one trans person, you don't know us all. You don't know, you know, the preferences of other trans people just because this is the preference of your friend. Um, so you might have this comfort with a friend where you can ask them about their body. Don't do that to people that you don't know.
mhm,
It is not okay to ask about medical transition, about surgeries, unless that conversation has been opened up by that person. Um, but beyond that, like I said before, Google is amazing. If you have questions about gender affirming care, you can Google it.
right.
If
And often that can be the most respectful thing to do, right?
Absolutely,
If you're
yeah,
curious in a moment, in a conversation, hold that thought and wait until you're at your computer and Google it.
yes,
Yeah. Um, we're kind of coming to the end of our interview. I've
yeah.
covered my questions. I wanted to ask if there was anything you had hoped to say on the show today that I didn't think to ask you.
Um, no, your questions were great. I do really want to drive home, that we the trans community, especially in the United States right now, really, really needs folks to speak out. There are so many anti-trans bills that have been introduced on the national level and the state level. 41 states have bills that are anti-trans on the docket. There have been 532 bills introduced in 2024 alone. Um, so it's something that we really need people to speak out about. We are a small community, and we can't be consistently advocating for ourselves, especially with this level of attack. So find out what's happening in your local community, find out what's happening in your state, find out what's happening federally, and really speak up and say, this is not okay. We will not accept this.
I think that is a really powerful note to end on. And I want to thank you, Taylor, for coming on the show and for being so authentic. Thank you for just being Taylor and giving us a great interview. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
This brings us to the end of this episode of It Matters How We Treat One Another. I want to give a very special thanks to our guest, Taylor Chazan. I also want to give a brief disclaimer. Taylor and I have known each other for 7 years, and Taylor is a trans advocate. Not every trans person is or wants to be a trans advocate. So please do not approach the next trans person you meet and pelt them with questions, even if you are well-intentioned. Thanks. And now for the takeaway. Here are your takeaways from this episode. Advancements in human rights are happening all over the world each and every day. The world is improving. Have hope. Trans people are people. Let's treat them with the same kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion we show towards everyone else. Using people's correct pronouns is rooted in basic decency and respect. It's a best practice not to do icebreakers that require people to share childhood photos. You might accidentally out a trans person this way. Google is a wonderful resource for general trans questions. It's a microaggression to ask a trans person invasive questions. Simply Google the things you're curious about. Being a friend and ally to a trans person means getting to know the whole person, including their personality and interests. Being a trans accomplice means speaking out against disinformation. The trans community needs cisgender. That means people who are the same gender as what's on their birth certificate. The trans community needs cisgender trans allies, accomplices, and advocates. If your child, youth, or teen comes out to you as trans, please love them and believe them. Let them know you will be there for them. Parents can help support their trans or non-binary child by having a friend group that reflects their child's identity. It is healthy for a trans child to know a trans adult who is thriving. Don't out trans people. It's their story to tell. If you accidentally misgender someone, simply correct yourself, apologize, and move on. Don't make it about yourself. And finally, trans folks are not a monolith. There is a great diversity amongst the trans community, and what is true for one trans person might not be true for another. Please subscribe to keep up with all of our episodes, and you can support the show by shopping our Etsy store at etsy.com/shop/itmattersmerch. There's a link in our description. Your quote of the week is, quote, "I want to change the world by making it much more friendly for trans people." That is from 12-year-old trans activist Trinity Neal. Amen, Trinity. And remember, treat everyone with kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion, and try for acceptance and love whenever possible. Be well, and much love to each and every one of you. Thanks.